"You're not supposed to be here," I said calmly, watching Karen from the HOA wave at my security camera while her Great Dane dropped a steamer in the middle of my koi pond rocks. 2 kids cut through my flower bed, crushing the irises I planted for my late wife. One of the teenagers looked directly into the lens, gave a mocking salute, and tossed a soda can on my patio. That's when I realized this wasn't just trespassing. This was war. And I wasn't about to let them win it with flip-flops and entitlement. They called it a shortcut. I called it a violation of everything decent. It started a few months after I moved into the neighborhood, a modest suburban patch with overly manicured lawns and a homeowners association drunk on its own power. I bought the property because it bordered a greenbelt, a strip of land they couldn't touch. Or so I thought. That greenbelt ran behind the HOA's clubhouse and connected to a trail that led to a community park. And somewhere along the way, someone decided my backyard made for a more convenient route than the winding sidewalks they were supposed to use. At first, it was just a jogger or two. I let it slide. Then came the morning walkers, the dog walkers, the stroller moms, and eventually, the kid scooter gangs. By the time I installed the first camera, my yard saw more traffic than the local Starbucks. I printed signs. Private property, no trespassing, use the sidewalk. Karen tore them down. Not once, not twice, but 7 times. The last time she replaced it with her own sign that said, "Community path, enjoy the walk." The audacity was Olympic level. When I confronted her at the monthly HOA meeting, she barely looked up from her latte. "Oh, that," she said, chuckling like I was a confused toddler. "That path's been there forever. It's a community easement. It's in the plans." I pulled out the actual survey document. No easement. No public access. Just private land, mine. "Well," she said with a shrug, "sometimes you just have to go with what works for everyone." Everyone, apparently, didn't include me. I filed a police report. The officer came by, nice enough guy, but shrugged when I showed him the footage. "Looks like a civil issue," he said, even as Karen's dog chased a squirrel past the porch in the background. "Try fencing it off." I did. They climbed it. I added signs. They laughed. I tried polite conversation. Karen's exact words were, "Don't take it personally, hon. We're just trying to enjoy the neighborhood." That's when she invited herself to use my backyard shed as a shade rest stop for their walking group. I told her no. She rolled her eyes and called me the anti-fun guy. The final straw? The gnomes. I had a collection of 6 whimsical garden gnomes my wife had adored. Each one had its own name, pose, and story. I'd placed them around the koi pond as a small tribute to her, a space of peace. One day I came home to find them shattered, knocked over by a stray soccer ball. A kid ran off laughing, and Karen, who had the gall to be lounging on a lawn chair just feet away, said, "You shouldn't put breakables where kids play." Where kids play. This was my yard, not a playground. That night, I sat in my workshop with a whiskey glass sweating beside me and a blueprint spread across the table. I wasn't going to fight them with lawyers. I wasn't going to yell at them anymore. I was going to use the one thing the HOA didn't expect from the grumpy old guy at the end of the lane. I was going to build something they couldn't ignore. Something they couldn't climb over or talk their way through. I was going to build a maze. But not just any maze. This was going to be a tactical grade, homeowner grade psychological obstacle course. Something that would confuse, disorient, and frustrate without ever technically hurting a soul. I had experience in logistics, structural design, and oh yeah, I once helped plan movement layouts for desert operations in Kandahar. If I could outwit the Taliban in a supply chain war, I could definitely outsmart Karen and her yoga walkers. I started discreetly. I had hedges delivered in the early morning. I told curious neighbors I was landscaping. They nodded approvingly. "Finally cleaning up the back," one of them said. They didn't know those shrubs were going to form 3 levels of looping, rotating walkways. I installed a series of lattice panels, but rigged them with hinges so some would open one way on Tuesdays, another way on weekends. My motion-activated sprinklers were calibrated to trigger a second delay after someone passed them, always soaking the last person in the line. I even got help from a couple of tech-savvy teenagers from across town who helped me wire sound emitters and discrete cameras. One of them asked me if this was for a movie set. I told him, "It's performance art." Karen, of course, remained oblivious. The first time she saw the hedges going up, she said, "Oh, a garden maze. How quaint." I smiled and said, "Something like that?" I spent weeks tuning it, walking it myself, timing the delays, adjusting the foliage. I placed reflective surfaces in just the right angles to confuse and redirect. I sprayed harmless scent trails that would mislead dogs. And then I left one trail, just one, that led to a central clearing with a solar-powered speaker. The speaker played a looped message that said, "Congratulations. You're lost." By the time I was done, my backyard had transformed into a botanical nightmare for trespassers and a masterpiece of passive-aggressive landscaping. And the best part? From my upstairs control room, a converted study lined with screens and monitors, I had the perfect view of every hedge, every turn, every scream of frustration. I didn't even have to be outside. I just had to wait. And so I waited, lemonade in hand, camera rolling. The shortcut was about to become the most unforgettable detour of their lives. The next morning came with the early hum of lawnmowers and the chirping of a world still blissfully unaware of the chaos I was about to orchestrate. I stepped into my yard with a tape measure and a notepad, pretending to examine some imaginary landscaping measurements. A few walkers passed by, nodding politely as if I were finally doing something productive with the space they'd already claimed. Karen strutted by with her usual posse of HOA loyalists, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, holding her oversized coffee mug with the word "Queen" bedazzled across it. She gave me a little wave and said, "Glad to see you're finally making it more accessible. I'd recommend a drinking fountain too." I smiled and nodded. She had no idea the hedge in front of her would soon become her own personal labyrinth of suffering. My plan had phases, and phase 1 was deception. I didn't want anyone knowing what I was actually building. So I told each curious neighbor something different. To one, I said it was a privacy hedge. To another, I claimed it was a therapeutic garden in memory of my wife. Someone else got the story that I was experimenting with permaculture. All of it was true, in a way. But none of it told the full story. Behind the false vines and friendly banter, I was constructing a living trap. One that didn't break any laws, used only plants and existing materials, and would turn my so-called shortcut into an endurance test. The hedges arrived in sections, pre-cultivated in my friend's nursery, each thick and lush, already 4 feet high and dense enough to obscure movement. I began assembling them in winding rows, offsetting every few feet to create bottlenecks and confusion zones. Then came the lattice dividers, painted in forest green to blend with the vegetation, some fixed, others installed on pivot hinges to create rotating passages. Most importantly, I embedded discrete iron posts at key junctions to prevent anyone from simply breaking through with brute force. It wasn't a prison, but it wasn't a playground either. For the maze's layout, I based it loosely on a tactical movement grid used in urban military simulations. The idea was to create loops that felt like progress until the person realized they were walking in circles. There were 6 key exit paths, but only one would ever be open at a time, determined by a randomized timing circuit that changed the accessible route every 90 minutes. I concealed the mechanics in fake rock planters with solar panels powering low-voltage actuators. It looked like a garden, but it functioned like a riddle wrapped in vines. Next came the sensory manipulation. I lined the inner maze with speakers hidden inside decorative birdhouses. When triggered by motion sensors, they emitted subtle audio cues, faint whispers, chirps, or the sound of footsteps walking just out of sight. I recorded a few HOA board meeting clips and set them to play on loop at dead ends, so Karen would turn a corner and hear her own voice saying something self-righteous like, We must maintain community standards. The result was disorienting and eerie, especially under the hot sun with no clear exit in sight. For lighting, I installed LED garden stakes that glowed faintly at night in misleading colors. Blue meant dead end. Yellow led you back to the beginning. Green suggested progress but always circled to the confusion zone. I knew I might never catch them at night, but it was important to keep the illusion going even when I wasn't watching. The piece de resistance was the center of the maze, a clearing with a stone bench, an ornamental fountain, and a plaque that read, "Enjoy your break." But remember, every choice has consequences. To keep things legal and clever, I posted a small laminated sign at the entrance from the greenbelt: "Landscaping under maintenance. Enter at your own risk." That sign alone was enough to shield me from liability. I even ran it by a lawyer friend who laughed for 10 straight minutes before giving me a thumbs up and a thumbs up emoji. Everything was set. By the end of week 2, the maze was complete, at least version 1 of it. I stood on my upstairs balcony, sipping coffee, and watched the sun rise over my botanical masterpiece. It looked peaceful, natural, almost inviting. Karen had walked by twice that morning but hadn't ventured in yet. I knew her type. She wanted to be watched. She'd wait until she had an audience, until she could make a show of it. So I gave her one. The following Saturday, I posted on the neighborhood app that I was opening the garden path as part of my community beautification initiative. I included a vague message about mindfulness and the joys of wandering without purpose. Within hours, curious residents started trickling through. Some came out confused. A few complained of the layout. One woman got stuck in the reflective corridor and swore she was seeing doubles. But they laughed it off. The maze was tricky but charming. And then Karen came. Dressed in a white tracksuit and flanked by her entourage, she strutted into the yard like she was on a catwalk. "This is adorable," she announced, tossing her iced coffee into my recycling bin. "I'm sure it'll help resale values. People love a touch of whimsy." I waved her in, thanked her for the support, and activated the real-time tracking on my security feed. It took 8 minutes for the first shriek. From my desk, I watched as Karen took the wrong path, hit the rotating panel, and was redirected into a loop. After 15 minutes, she passed the same hedge 4 times. I triggered the speaker that played her own voice saying, "This isn't up to code." Her face twisted in confusion. One of her friends tried to follow her but ended up in the corner loop that led to the echo chamber. They shouted to each other, each voice bouncing back louder and more distorted. And then the sprinklers hit. A light spray misted over the hedge, drenching them with scented water infused with lavender and vinegar. Harmless, but enough to soak their clothes and their pride. They screamed, stumbled, tried to exit, only to find themselves deeper in the maze. I watched, stone-faced, as Karen yelled, "This is harassment," into the bushes. One of her followers tried to climb over a hedge and landed in a patch of mulch that triggered a camera flash and a rooster sound effect. 25 minutes. That's how long it took before Karen finally emerged from the side gate, panting, wet, purple-streaked from one of the dye-marked sprinklers. She pointed a trembling finger at my door and shouted, "You'll regret this." I smiled, waved, and said, "Have a refreshing day." And with that, Phase 2 was complete. The maze wasn't just functional. It was personal now. And Karen? She had no idea I'd only just begun. The following morning, my inbox was flooded with messages from neighbors. Most were variations of praise, laughing emojis, or genuine curiosity. A few people even asked if they could bring their kids by to walk the maze. Someone jokingly asked if I was open for private parties. The entire community chat group was buzzing about the Karen incident, although no one referred to her by name. The story of her soaked retreat, the purple streaks on her tracksuit, and the confusing loop of her own voice echoing from the bushes had spread like wildfire. I didn't need to tell anyone what happened. The maze had spoken for itself. But Karen wasn't the type to slink away and accept humiliation. No, she did what any overconfident, self-important HOA president would do. She called an emergency board meeting and put me on the agenda. Not my maze, not the trespassing issue, not the property dispute, just me. I got the email the same day. It read, Community Disruption and Nuisance Complaint, Subject, Mr. Stephen Callahan. It had the official HOA header with an unnecessary watermark of an eagle and some Latin motto that I doubted anyone on the board could actually translate. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't need to. I just printed it out, highlighted the phrase, alleged acts of aggression via landscaping, and taped it on the inside of the maze's entrance. I figured future trespassers should know exactly what they were getting into. The day of the meeting arrived with theatrical overtones. Karen made sure the boardroom was packed. Folding chairs filled with Karen's loyalists, clipboard warriors, and nosy neighbors formed tight rows. The snack table was overflowing with store-bought pastries, likely a peace offering for the disaster she was about to cause. I walked in wearing a t-shirt that said, I survived the HOA maze, freshly printed from a novelty store the night before. I sat quietly in the back while Karen stood up front like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments in a courtroom drama. He has intentionally created a psychological hazard, she barked, pointing toward a large printed photo of her covered in sprinkler dye. Someone in the back chuckled. She spun toward them with the glare of a dragon denied a meal. Not only has this structure disoriented residents, but it poses a safety risk to children, seniors, and small dogs. Another photo flashed on the screen behind her, this one showing one of her followers mid-jump over a hedge. This isn't community building, she added. It's community terrorizing. One of the board members, a guy named Dennis who always looked like he was stuck between sneezing and falling asleep, raised a hand. So, just to be clear, you were trespassing on his land? Karen's nostrils flared. It's been used as a common path for years, she insisted. He can't just change it into some sort of trap. That's when I stood up, walked to the front, and pulled out a folder. I calmly laid down property surveys, dated documents, local zoning laws, and a notarized letter from the county office stating, in unambiguous language, that my property had never included an easement, shared path, or right-of-way for any HOA use. Then I produced a laminated list of trespassing incidents captured on my security feed, each one dated, and highlighted the names of residents who had entered without permission. The room went still. Karen snatched the papers, scanned them, then looked up and said, But people are used to going through there. That was her defense. Custom. Habit. Entitlement wrapped in familiarity. One of the newer board members, a retired judge named Miriam, leaned forward and said, Used to doing something illegal doesn't make it legal. I once had a guy argue he shouldn't get a DUI because he drank at the same bar every night. Guess how that turned out? Karen's smile cracked for the first time. I almost felt bad. Almost. Then she tried the next move. The legal threat. You'll be hearing from our attorney, she warned, flipping her phone screen toward me with an email draft open. This is an HOA-backed demand letter. I replied, Good. My attorney would love a new dartboard. Laughter rippled across the room. Even Dennis cracked a smile. Back at home that evening, I poured a drink and settled into my upstairs control room. The maze footage from the last week had been gold. A compilation I edited together was already gaining traction on Reddit. I didn't post it under my name, I used a burner account, but the title read, Karen vs. Tactical Garden Maze, She Loses. It had already been cross-posted to several subreddits, including r/public freakout and r/HOA fails. Comments rolled in non-stop. This guy is a genius. Maze Daddy strikes again. Please install a fog machine next. By the following morning, I had over 500 direct messages, ranging from requests to replicate the maze design to sponsorship offers from a company that made outdoor obstacle gear. One guy even asked if I would sell the maze's blueprints as NFTs. I politely declined. This wasn't about monetization, This was about principle. But Karen wasn't done. Of course not. The next day, I noticed a group of residents outside the maze entrance, all with cameras. Karen had brought a news crew from a local affiliate station. She stood in front of my hedge wall with dramatic lighting and a prepared speech. "We're standing here where one man's obsession has disrupted an entire community," she said. "This hedge maze has become a menace." I stepped outside just in time to hear the reporter say, "Sir, would you like to comment on the allegations that you've weaponized your landscaping?" I gave a tight-lipped smile. "Weaponized? You mean by growing plants on my own land?" "Well," the reporter added, glancing back at Karen, "they say people are getting trapped." "If someone walks into a puzzle and doesn't know they're in a puzzle," I said, "maybe the puzzle isn't the problem." The reporter blinked. The cameraman stifled a grin. Karen stormed off in a huff. That evening, the news segment aired. It was intended to be neutral, but the footage of Karen gesturing wildly while covered in purple dye replayed like an unintentional blooper reel. My brief interview, clipped with my final quote about the puzzle, went viral. The maze became a minor sensation. Memes exploded online. Someone edited Karen into footage of the shining hedge maze. Another looped her shouting into the bushes with circus music. A TikTok creator even made a parody dance. Despite her efforts, Karen's credibility with the neighborhood began to crumble. The board was split. Some found the whole situation funny, others wanted to avoid the legal heat she was bringing. Meanwhile, a few neighbors started asking me if I'd let them escape the HOA maze as a game on weekends. I didn't answer right away. I had more phases planned. Karen still thought this was the end of my tricks. But it wasn't. It was only the middle. The game wasn't over. It was evolving. And soon, everyone would see just how deep the maze really went. 3 days after the news segment aired, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed entirely. People who had never spoken to me before were now waving when they passed by my house. A few kids even left handmade notes near the maze, with crayon-scribbled messages like, "Best maze ever," and "Karen got owned." I didn't respond to any of them publicly, but each morning I found myself smiling as I watered the hedges and checked the pressure sensors. I hadn't just built a deterrent. I had unknowingly created a community attraction. But while the laughter spread, something else began to take shape beneath the surface. An unease I could feel growing in Karen's shadow. The next phase wasn't something I had initially planned. It came as a reaction to a series of quiet visits. HOA board members began dropping by one at a time, pretending to be interested in the maze, asking veiled questions about who had helped me build it or whether I had applied for any city permit. One asked, "Is this registered as a recreational structure?" Another said, "It might qualify as a public safety hazard if people keep getting disoriented." I knew what this was. Karen was applying pressure behind the scenes, trying to leverage city bureaucracy to turn public opinion against me. They weren't here to tour a garden. They were casing the place for weaknesses. I called my attorney just to be sure. He laughed after 5 minutes on the phone and said, "Tell them to pound sand. You're well within your rights. But if they keep sniffing around, maybe it's time to take a few precautions of your own." That call sparked Phase 4. I added signage. Professional, tasteful, legally watertight. Laminated notices at each entrance now read, "Private property. Do not enter without explicit permission, surveillance in use." Then, just for flavor, I added a sign shaped like a jester's face near the entrance that said, "Caution. Those who enter without consent may leave without dignity." Not legally required, but emotionally satisfying. That weekend, something strange happened. A man I'd never seen before, late 50s, pressed khakis, clipboard, stood at the edge of the greenbelt, surveying the maze with narrowed eyes. I stepped outside and greeted him. He introduced himself as an independent safety assessor, claiming he'd been asked by the HOA to perform a review. No ID, no badge, nothing formal. I told him I had no obligation to let him on the property and that, if he crossed the line, He'd be violating state trespass laws. He smirked and walked away, but not before muttering, "We'll see about that." That night, under the soft hum of the surveillance monitors, I sat watching the loop again. Nothing unusual until just after 2 a.m., when the screen flickered with movement. A shadow moved along the hedge wall. Two people, one with a flashlight, the other with what looked like bolt cutters. They tried to snip through the metal frame disguised inside the lattice. Sparks flew. Nothing gave way. One of them slipped, fell into the mulch trap, and triggered the motion-activated rooster screech. They ran off in a panic. I sent the footage to the police, logged it officially, and emailed it to the HOA board under the subject: "Attempted property sabotage, security footage attached." Karen didn't reply directly. Instead, the next day I found a notice posted on my door from the HOA declaring that my landscape structure was under formal review for community compliance. It listed possible violations including obstruction of view, unsafe features, and psychological disturbance to neighbors. Psychological disturbance. I had to laugh. They were accusing me of landscaping-induced emotional trauma. I showed the letter to a few neighbors I trusted, and one of them, Angela, a retired school principal, snapped a photo and posted it on her private Facebook group with the caption, "When the queen of the HOA loses at her own game." That post got shared more than 100 times in the next 2 days, and someone turned the letter into a parody song online. Karen was losing control fast, and she knew it. But she wasn't done. At the next board meeting, she arrived with a city code enforcement officer in tow. They were trying to play the final card, the one they thought would win by default: government muscle. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but my friend Dennis on the board slipped me a copy of the minute. Karen had gone on record calling my maze a public nuisance. The officer, however, had visited the property earlier that day and found nothing out of compliance. In fact, the only violation he cited was the HOA's own unauthorized sign postings near my fence. That revelation, delivered mid-meeting, was apparently the final nail. According to Dennis, Karen erupted, accusing the rest of the board of sabotage and favoritism. Miriam, the retired judge, calmly asked her to leave the meeting until she could compose herself like an adult. She left, but not before vowing to take this all the way up. No one knew what she meant by up. Maybe she thought the governor cared about backyard hedge mazes. In the days that followed, Karen's influence cratered. She wasn't seen at her usual walking group meetup. The HOA message board was quieter, less hostile. A new proposal appeared for a vote, one calling for term limits on HOA leadership. It passed by a wide margin. At the next board meeting, Karen didn't show. Instead, she submitted a resignation letter, citing a toxic and unsupportive environment. Someone printed it out and left copies at the clubhouse, each one edited with a doodle of a little cartoon maze in the margins. The maze, meanwhile, was thriving. I began offering guided walkthroughs on weekends. Kids loved it. Retirees came by to see what all the fuss was about. I added trivia signs along the path with questions about community history, fun facts about local plants, and even quotes from past HOA newsletters. People started bringing picnic lunches. It had transformed from a revenge tool into a community destination, ironically, the very thing Karen always claimed she wanted to create. Only now, it existed in direct defiance of her methods. And through it all, I kept refining it. I rotated the hedge panels, adjusted the sound cues, upgraded the sprinkler timers, and added a little speaker near the exit that now played a short triumphant tune when someone made it through. I called it the victory chime. It wasn't necessary, but it felt right. Looking back, the maze had become more than just a clever revenge. It was a symbol, not just of standing your ground, but of doing so with creativity, precision, and a little bit of flair. Karen tried to control everything, through rules, threats, and force, but she underestimated the one thing she couldn't regulate: imagination. I didn't just push back. I redirected the whole flow of power, through hedges and mulch and lavender-scented water. and by the time she realized she'd lost control, the maze had grown too large for her to tear down. It had rooted itself into the heart of the neighborhood, and there was no shortcut around that. Spring settled over the neighborhood with a kind of peace that hadn't been felt in years. The streets were quieter, not because people weren't out, but because there was no more shouting, no more HOA patrols scribbling passive-aggressive notes or measuring lawn edges with rulers. Karen's resignation hadn't just been a leadership change, it was like a toxin had been drained from the system. For the first time since I moved in, I saw actual smiles when neighbors waved, instead of the tight, suspicious ones they used to give. The maze had become more than just a backyard structure. It had become a kind of healing ground, ironically, for the very community it had been designed to protect myself from. By now, I had added subtle touches that made the maze even more engaging. A few motion-activated voice clips triggered phrases like, "Good luck" or "Turn back while you can," and the kids in the neighborhood started calling it the Backyard Labyrinth. Someone even made a Google Maps pin for it titled, "Escape from Karen." I didn't make that. It just appeared one day and I left it. It was oddly poetic. One Saturday morning, I was outside clipping the edges of a particularly overgrown hedge when a woman in her 40s approached with her young son in tow. She introduced herself as Lisa and said she had recently moved into a house 2 blocks away. Her son, Adam, had autism, and she explained that he loved patterns and puzzles, and after hearing about the maze from other kids, it had become his new obsession. She was cautious, not sure if it was okay, and asked if it would be too much trouble to let him walk through. I told her it would be no trouble at all. As Adam wandered into the entrance, his eyes wide with wonder, I watched him pause at each turn, tapping the hedge, smiling when the speaker said, "Wrong way," and giggling when the rooster sound went off near the old mulch trap. Lisa stood beside me with tears brimming in her eyes and said softly, "You know, you could have just put up a wall. Most people would have. But you made something better." That moment stuck with me more than anything else that had happened during this whole battle. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Somewhere between the sprinklers and the scent bombs, the maze had transformed into something with a bigger purpose. And yet, justice hadn't forgotten to arrive either. It had simply arrived with a sense of humor and style. Later that week, I received a formal-looking envelope with the county seal. For a moment, I thought Karen had managed to pull some final strings, but to my surprise, it was an invitation. Apparently, my maze had become such a viral topic that it caught the attention of a state committee interested in innovative community projects. They wanted to present me with a small community engagement award for transformative conflict resolution through creative architecture. I almost laughed at the wording, but there it was in writing. A project born of frustration and pettiness was now being used as an example of civic ingenuity. The local paper wrote a feature on the neighborhood's transformation. They interviewed residents, asked questions about the HOA, the fallout from Karen's reign, and how the community had become closer without the constant pressure of overregulation. My name wasn't the headline, but I was quoted enough that it might as well have been. They called it "The Maze That Changed Everything." It was cheesy, but I couldn't deny the truth of it. It had. As for Karen, she didn't vanish entirely. Word floated around that she had relocated to a different development on the far side of town, one without an HOA. The irony practically wrote itself. Apparently, she had tried to start a community Facebook group in her new area, but the residents there were already wise to her brand of control. She'd been kicked from the group after only 3 posts. I received an anonymous postcard one day with no return address. It had a picture of a hedge on the front and the words, "Still can't find my way out." I didn't know who sent it, but I had a good guess. Meanwhile, the maze kept evolving. I installed solar-powered fairy lights that turned on at dusk, giving the whole structure a soft glow that felt more enchanted than ominous. I hosted a small fundraiser one weekend with proceeds going to a local shelter. We raised over $4,000. Even the city council took notice, and one member came by with her son, who declared the maze 10 times better than Minecraft. That was high praise, apparently. I hadn't planned for any of this. It started with anger and a need for peace. I just wanted to be left alone, to enjoy my backyard without being trampled by self-important people who believed rules didn't apply to them. But the maze had offered something no rule ever could: perspective. It didn't just trap people, it forced them to reflect, to navigate confusion, to face consequences. And when they came out the other side, they weren't just wet or disoriented. They were humbled. The final piece I added to the maze wasn't a wall or a trap or another clever joke. It was a bench. A single stone bench at the center, under the oak tree that shaded the heart of the labyrinth. On the back, I carved a simple message: respect is the only real shortcut. I didn't tell anyone who the quote belonged to. Most assumed it was something I read online. But it was my own. My quiet little statement to everyone who dared cut corners in life at the expense of others. Because I had learned something important along the way, about patience, about creativity, about standing your ground without losing your soul in the process. Neighbors still come by. Kids still run through. Adults laugh when they get stuck or sprayed or hear their own voices played back in odd echoes. The maze is alive, always shifting, always offering a lesson. Some enter expecting a joke and leave thinking. Others just come for fun. But no one walks through it now thinking they're above it. That part, at least, is over. Karen tried to break the rules. I rewrote the game. And now the game belongs to everyone else.